Welcome to the ITI Online Academy Learning module, Locating and Evaluating Relevant Scientific Literature by Stephen Eckert. Ongoing identification and evaluation of relevant scientific literature is a fundamental factor in providing patients with the most current and appropriate treatment possible. This module will present step-by-step techniques for searching the scientific literature together with criteria for assessing the quality of the resulting literature. After completing this ITI Online Academy module, you should be able to identify the forms and location of dental literature, understand the types of bias in research studies and how bias can be minimized, identify the levels of scientific evidence and their merits, establish an effective literature search, and recognize the value of a personal reference management database. The term dental literature refers to the entire body of writing in the field of dentistry. However, clinicians need to understand that not all sources of dental literature qualify as scientific information. Sources can vary widely in the degree of scrutiny to which they are subjected prior to publication, and sources do not necessarily provide reliable, truthful answers to clinical questions. When considering scientific literature for the purpose of clinical decision-making, one baseline requisite is that it be carefully analyzed using a process called peer review. Dental literature can be retrieved from many different sources. The first source to be consulted on a subject is often a textbook, as is customary for students learning a new subject. Although many dental textbooks are developed from accumulated scientific material, they may or may not be based on peer-reviewed scientific literature. Dental textbooks usually include so-called established knowledge, such as anatomy, physical properties of materials, or adverse effects of drugs. Upon completion of formal dental education, a dentist may transition to reading non-peer-reviewed trade journals and manufacturer brochures. An absence of peer review does not mean that a source of information has no merit at all, but a lack of scrutiny means that the information may be liable to misinterpretation. Trade journals are issued by commercial publishers and typically contain a lot of advertisements. Similarly, manufacturer publications in the form of so-called white papers may be based on scientific literature, but may not truly be peer-reviewed. Such publications are primarily marketing tools. When a dentist identifies a knowledge gap, ideally he or she should seek an answer in the scientific literature. Scientific journals have editorial policies requiring the peer review process. That process should be easy to understand and should be clearly articulated to the readership. Scientific journals are published by scholarly societies, such as the International Association for Dental Research, professional organizations such as the British Dental Association, or reputable scientific publishers such as Quintessence. It's important to understand the process of peer review that gives scientific literature greater credibility than trade journals, commercial publications, or popular media. It's a quality control step that helps editors of scientific journals to decide to publish or reject a submitted manuscript. While guidelines exist to guide peer review, each scientific journal has its own peer review process. In general, experts from the same field of study as the researchers submitting the manuscript are asked to provide a critique of the work to ensure its suitability for publication. They scrutinize the manuscript for quality, relevance, and importance. They aim to confirm that it doesn't include fabricated data or plagiarism. Based on the results of peer review, a journal's editors can decide to reject a paper outright or to request revision prior to publication. Most manuscripts are sent back to the researchers for at least minor revisions. Articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals should use a standard format for the presentation of information. A paper should begin with a structured abstract that summarizes or gives a synopsis of the paper by briefly detailing the objectives, methods, results, and conclusions of the research. The body of the paper follows the abstract. The introduction lays the foundation for the paper and should include the importance of the research question being addressed, gaps in the current knowledge base, and the objectives of the study or research question. The methods section should provide sufficient detail about the study methods, such that the study could be reproduced if desired. It should describe the materials used in the study and explain their preparation, describe the research protocol, and explain how measurements were made for data collection, and state which statistical tests were done to analyze the data. In the results section, the manuscript author should report the data, observations, and other findings without interpretation. If the study was clinical research on human patients, a description of the participants should be included. Data should be presented in a logical sequence, using text as well as tables and figures to improve understanding of the study results by the reader. In the discussion section, the results of the study are interpreted. The main findings of the study are also considered with reference to previous research. Clinical or practice implications of the results should be given. In addition, the author should analyze the strengths and limitations of the study. Finally, the reference list contains all the sources cited in the manuscript, such as journal articles and books. Scientific literature is indexed in a variety of electronic, internet-based databases. Google Scholar, Scopus, and the Cochrane Library are a few examples. The most commonly used database for biomedical topics is Medline, which is part of the US National Library of Medicine. It contains about 22 million citations from over 5,500 journals. The interface for searching Medline is PubMed, which is free and provides access to over 25 million citations. Links to full-text articles are provided when available, although a fee may be required to view the article. In addition to the Medline citations, PubMed includes citations for in-process articles ahead of print, and free access to full-text articles in the PubMed Central Archive. Forms and location of dental literature, key learning points. There are a number of different sources of literature available to assist continuing dental education. The peer review process of scrutiny by colleagues gives scientific literature greater credibility than other forms of dental literature. Scientific articles are written in a structured format of abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and references. PubMed is a widely used free search engine for accessing journal citations and abstracts of biomedical literature. Scientific literature is developed through scientific investigation and provides answers to questions pertaining to patient treatment. Therefore, published research studies are often referred to as evidence. However, differences in scientific investigation cause some evidence to be more valid than others. Validity is a measure of how accurately the evidence reflects the truth. The greatest threat to the validity of a research study is bias. Some types of research studies are more susceptible to bias than others. The best evidence is that which is least biased. Bias is defined as the presence of factors that have the potential to systematically distort the results, conclusions, or dissemination of a research study. It can occur at any phase of research. Research bias occurs during planning and execution of a study. Reporting bias occurs during the data analysis and publication phases after completion of a study. The list of potential sources of bias is exhaustive, and only a few sources will be outlined for this module. One form of research bias is selection bias, which is an error in choosing the individuals or groups to take part in a study. The subjects in a study should be very similar to one another and to the larger population from which they are drawn. Response bias occurs when subjects fashion their responses to please the investigator, or believe they know the expected findings and change their behaviors and responses to match. The so-called placebo effect is a type of response bias. Recall bias occurs when subjects' recollections of events prior to or during the study vary in accuracy or completeness. Following completion of a study and submission of a manuscript, there may be a publication bias against the study that fails to demonstrate a statistically significant difference in clinical outcomes between the experimental and control groups. Research with statistically significant results is more likely to be published. Citation bias occurs because studies with positive results are more likely to be cited in scientific writing than those with negative results. The tendency to publish positive results in English is known as language bias. Investigators can use a variety of strategies to minimize bias. Use of a clearly identified study design that is appropriate to the research question is fundamental to avoiding bias. Prospective study designs have less risk of bias than retrospective studies. Prospective studies go forward in time to follow a patient and gather new data, such as changes in marginal bone height or development of peri-implantitis. Retrospective studies, on the other hand, go back in time to collect data on participants through interviews or previously recorded information, and therefore are at risk of recall bias. Other flaws in the design of the study, such as the selection methods by which patients are enrolled in the study or the assignment of patients into one treatment group or the other, can introduce bias that can skew the study results, thereby invalidating the outcomes of the research. The number of subjects or patients included in a study should be large enough to demonstrate a difference between two or more treatment groups if such a difference does in fact exist. The duration of the study should be long enough to observe any anticipated complications and to measure the outcome of interest. Control groups allow the investigators to measure one variable at a time, giving reliable baseline data with which to compare the results in the test or experimental group. Use of a control group ensures that any conclusions drawn as to the effectiveness of a new treatment can be attributed solely to the administration of that treatment and not to other factors. Patients in the control group may be free of the disease or condition of interest, or may receive a placebo treatment or no treatment during the study period. The test and control groups should otherwise be treated the same. Randomization is a powerful tool to reduce bias. Randomly assigning research participants to either the test or control groups helps ensure that, other than the intervention or treatment being studied, the different groups will be comparable with respect to known and unknown variables. Randomization means that potentially confounding factors, such as age and gender, will be approximately evenly distributed between the test and control groups. Blinding is the process in which those involved in a study remain ignorant concerning which treatment the participants are receiving. Blinding minimizes conscious or unconscious bias in the conduct and interpretation of a study. Bias in research studies. Key learning points. Bias is the greatest threat to the validity of scientific literature. Bias can distort the results, conclusions, or dissemination of a research study. Bias can occur at any stage of a research study. Use of an appropriate study design and strategies, such as randomization and blinding, can minimize bias. Different types of scientific evidence are arranged in a hierarchy corresponding to their risk of bias. This hierarchy may be referred to as the evidence pyramid. The best evidence to inform decisions regarding patient care is that which is the least biased and is closest to the top of the evidence pyramid. The Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine has established a hierarchy with more detailed levels of evidence. They use a numbering scheme that ranges from 1A, homogeneous systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials, to 5, expert opinion. Both the evidence pyramid and the numbered hierarchy shown here are associated with evidence in the domain of therapy or treatment. There are other hierarchies for the domains of prognosis, diagnosis, and harm. The lowest levels of evidence are observational studies. The investigators observe subjects and measure variables of interest without assigning treatments to the subjects. Expert opinion is given on a specific procedure, technique, or material. A single case report discusses an individual case and is often in the form of a detailed story. As clinicians start to accumulate data on their clinical experiences, case series that report on multiple patients are developed. These case series represent information that has been developed with some consistency and that has been analyzed with some rigor. Consequently, the level of scientific information derived from such studies represents an improvement over that of a case report. These three types of articles represent the lowest level of scientific evidence because they are isolated observations collected in an uncontrolled, unsystematic manner. There is no comparison group, no statistical analysis, and no randomization. A case control study is an observational study of two groups of patients experiencing a different clinical outcome. Those with a condition or disease are called the cases, and those without the disorder are the controls. Data on exposure to a risk factor such as smoking or diabetes is gathered retrospectively to examine the relationship between the risk factor and the disease or condition. Case control studies are often used in epidemiologic research. A cohort study is a prospective observational study in which patients are grouped into a cohort based on prior exposure to a risk factor or treatment. Comparisons are made between the cohort and another group. Comparison groups may be the general population, another cohort in which the intervention or disease is not present, or even subgroups within the cohort. The patients are then followed forward in time, and comparisons are made between the cohort and the comparison group to see how many in each group develop a particular disease or other outcome. For example, in one study, pregnant women were assigned to cohorts based on their periodontal disease status at 21 to 24 weeks gestation. At delivery, their infant's gestational age at birth was recorded, so that the investigators could determine if an association existed between the mother's periodontal disease status during pregnancy and preterm birth. In experimental studies, the intervention is under the control of the investigators. The dominant type of experimental study is the randomized controlled trial, in which the investigators introduce a treatment or procedure and study its effect on patients. Randomized controlled trials have the greatest potential to reduce bias using methodologies such as randomization to keep study groups as similar as possible from the outset, blinding or double blinding of both investigators and patients, predetermination of the number of patients or sample size needed to show an effect of the treatment, appropriate and predetermined outcome measures, and statistical analysis. Randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for answering research questions related to therapy or treatment because they have the lowest potential for bias and can provide sound evidence of cause and effect. For example, patients with 5 to 7 millimeters of bone height in the posterior maxilla could be randomly allocated to receive either a short implant or a long implant in conjunction with sinus floor elevation and augmentation. The status of the implants could then be compared clinically and radiographically 12 months after loading. Note that in some instances it may be impossible or unethical to have a control group or an untreated group. For example, it would be unethical to design a randomized controlled trial on peri-implantitis, comparing one type of treatment to no treatment, or to a treatment that is known not to be effective. Rather than base important treatment decisions on a single research study, clinicians often look to a type of scientific literature called a systematic review for a more definitive answer to a clinical question. A systematic review synthesizes and summarizes the best available research on a specific topic. For example, the influence of inter-implant distance on the crestal bone height around implants. Systematic reviews use an established, rigorous methodology to locate and combine all relevant studies addressing the same question. First, an extensive literature search is conducted of multiple databases in addition to Medline. The authors of the systematic review will attempt to locate both published and unpublished research studies. Each study is then checked against predetermined criteria for eligibility to be included in the systematic review. Individual included studies are assessed for quality and bias, and the results of the included studies are summarized in a qualitative fashion. If possible, the results of the included studies are statistically pooled together in a process called meta-analysis to provide a quantitative summary. Although the evidence-based hierarchy aids greatly in the understanding of study designs and their levels of bias, there are other factors that should be considered when assessing the quality of scientific evidence. Some key factors are directness of interpretation of results and consistency of outcomes, that is, whether or not multiple studies consistently demonstrate the same results. Another factor is the precision of the evidence, as shown by narrow confidence intervals. A confidence interval is a statistic that is typically stated as part of the results of a study. It's defined as a range of values within which the true value is likely to be, given the data observed in a study. Results with narrow confidence intervals are associated with greater confidence in the outcome of the clinical study. In a systematic review, homogeneity increases confidence. Homogeneity is the degree to which the results of all studies included in a review are similar. Levels of scientific evidence, key learning points. Different study designs are arranged in a hierarchy corresponding to their level of bias. Randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for an individual study on therapy. Systematic reviews synthesize and summarize the best available research on a specific topic to give a more definitive answer to a clinical question. In addition to bias, other factors such as consistency, directness, and precision must be considered when assessing the truth of scientific literature. Choosing the best resource to search is an important decision. Each database has nuances that affect both their usefulness and the learning curve required for efficient searching. For example, Google Scholar uses the Google interface and search algorithms to find articles from academic publishers, professional societies, and other sources, in addition to scholarly articles available across the Internet. The Cochrane Library provides access to a database of systematic reviews that summarize the results from a number of studies. Scopus provides the user with a citation index that shows how frequently a specific article has been cited by others. It also finds additional articles that cite the articles found in the user's searches. However, PubMed is the database of choice for beginning most searches in dentistry. Included in its 25 million citations are very recent articles that are not yet indexed for Medline. Many users are keen to find these recent citations. No matter which database you select, time spent in learning its search system is gained back when you execute a well-honed search that yields relevant citations. Search terms and effective use of tools to focus or expand your search will produce a comprehensive listing of references. For the purposes of this learning module, further discussion of searching tools will be limited to PubMed. Typing pubmed.gov into your internet browser will bring up the PubMed homepage. The PubMed homepage includes a link to the PubMed Quick Start Guide. Using this Quick Start section is the fastest way to begin using PubMed. Another link on PubMed homepage, PubMed Tutorials, provides access to PubMed online training with tutorials and videos on basic and advanced search tools. From the online training page, you can also download and print trifold handouts with instructions for various types of searches. There is also a link to non-English PubMed training guides. Although you may search by author or journal name or look for a specific citation within PubMed, Most clinicians search for a topic of interest. Topics may be searched in two general ways: with simple keywords or with medical subject headings, or MESH. In either case, the more specific the search terms, the smaller the number of results that the search will yield, while searching for general or broad terms will return a much larger number of citations. Prior to conducting a search, it's also important to specify the relationships between two or more search terms using the Boolean operators AND, OR, and NOT. AND will limit results by combining search terms and only retrieving citations that contain all search terms. OR will expand results by retrieving citations that contain at least one of the search terms. NOT retrieves a set of results from which one entire search term and any instances of overlap are eliminated. Keywords are natural language or ordinary language terms. For a keyword search, identify the key concepts for your search. For example, dental implant immediate loading. Enter the keywords in the search box at the top of the home page and click Search. The results of the search are displayed in summary format. Note that a keyword search may return many false hits that are off topic. Medical subject headings, or MESH, are a controlled vocabulary list of over 25,000 headings. Most citations in PubMed have MESH terms assigned to them to describe the content of the article. Experts in the appropriate field read the articles and assign the most specific MESH terms that describe the article's content. Searches using MESH terms provide greater consistency in retrieval of information. To execute a MESH search from the PubMed homepage, click on the link to the MESH database. The MESH database is like a thesaurus that translates your natural language terms into MESH. Entering terms into the search box will return one or more MESH terms. The appropriate MESH term can be selected and added to the PubMed search builder. In this example, the MESH database mapped our natural language terms to immediate dental implant loading. If desired, more MESH terms can be added to the search builder using AND, OR, or NOT to group the MESH terms and refine the search. The results of a MESH search are displayed in the same summary format as a key concept search. Repeating our original search, but instead using the MESH term immediate dental implant loading, returns 582 citations. If your search strategy yields too many citations, filters can be applied to narrow the results. Filter options appear to the left of the list of results. The default list of filter options shows only the most popular filters. Clicking on a filter will apply it to your results. A useful filter category is article types, from which you can select clinical trial, systematic reviews, and others. Note that filtering the results of our MESH search for clinical trials has narrowed the results to a more manageable list of 120. PubMed has a specialized search tool called Clinical Queries to provide efficient answers to clinical questions. This tool uses built-in filters to search for the best evidence in clinical study categories such as etiology, diagnosis, therapy, or prognosis. You can also search for systematic reviews on your topic using Clinical Queries. Note that repeating our search for dental implant immediate loading in Clinical Queries has located 85 systematic reviews. Effective literature searches key learning points. The initial step is selecting a database. PubMed is recommended for dental searches. PubMed provides links to instructions and tutorials on its homepage. Specific search terms and the appropriate use of AND, OR, and NOT will provide ideal results. Medical subject headings, or MESH, are a controlled vocabulary that describes an article's contents. Searches based on MESH terms provide consistent results. Filters will further limit the citations identified in a search. The Clinical Queries tool quickly locates evidence for clinical questions, including systematic reviews. Over time, most clinicians will locate, read and review a large body of scientific literature in a variety of formats. Keeping track of the scientific literature that you encounter is facilitated by the use of a reference manager. These tools allow the compilation of many citations or references into a personal database that can be easily updated, organized, searched, and shared with colleagues. A reference management database is like having a personal PubMed. Features vary among the reference managers available. Important available features include the ability to import citations from bibliographic databases such as PubMed or Scopus, organize citations within the reference manager database into folders, add notes to citations and articles, search within one's library of references, and share part or all of one's reference library with other users. An efficient reference manager also simplifies the process of preparing a scientific paper for publication or presentation by facilitating in-text citations and producing formatted citations for bibliographies and reference lists. The personal database is created over time. It's important to make a habit of storing all useful references on topics of interest as you come across them. There are several ways to build a reference collection. Adding a reference manually, which is necessary when the material is not online, such as older articles or books. Transferring references from databases like PubMed. Downloading a reference from an online journal, or extracting reference data from a PDF of an article. Many reference managers will allow the user to access large online biomedical databases from within the application, allowing previously used search strategies to be repeated. This feature facilitates regular updating of the personal reference database. There are a number of commercially available reference managers that vary according to the features offered. A few popular reference managers in the biomedical field are RefWorks, Mendeley, and EndNote. There are several considerations to choosing a manager such as cost, learning curve, ease of importing citations, and compatible file types such as PDFs. Most reference managers are internet-based, although EndNote offers both an internet-based version as well as a software application in which all data is saved to the user's computer. Reference management databases, key learning points. A reference manager stores and organizes citations from searches of the scientific literature, like a personal PubMed. The reference list created is searchable and can be expanded as needed. A reference management database can aid in adding citations to papers and presentations. Cost, ease of use, and other features should be considered when choosing a reference manager. Locating and evaluating relevant scientific literature, module summary. Not all dental literature is scientific in nature. Peer-reviewed journals represent scientific literature. Bias is the greatest threat to the validity of scientific literature. A hierarchy of evidence recognizes the potential for bias in scientific literature. Consistency, directness, and precision of results also affect the relative value of study results. Randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for individual studies, and systematic reviews, which synthesize multiple studies on a specific topic, give a more definitive answer to a clinical question. PubMed is the recommended database for dental literature searches. When searching for scientific literature, mesh terms and the appropriate use of and, or, and not provide consistent results. Reference managers compile citations or references into a personal database that can be easily updated, organized, searched, and shared.